is Russell Conte. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to sew button loops using paper as a template for that. You'll need a piece of fabric 3.5 inches wide by 8 inches in height, and also a piece of contrast that's fused that will act as our facing. For our button loops, we'll want a piece of bias cut 1 inch wide. I'm going to also show you how to fill that bias. I use something that's referred to as soutache, or sometimes referred to as a rat tail. This is 2 millimeter wide. Your awl or your stiletto will help you really well. And then finally, some method to turn the tube once we've sewn the bias into a tube. Without further ado, let's get right to it. What you'll need is a piece of bias that's cut 1 inch wide. That's much more width than you're going to need for this. However, it makes it much easier to sew if you've got some extra width to hold on to. What we're going to do is we're going to place it faces together. And then I like to sew it at what I call a fat eighth. Not quite an eighth of an inch, but a little fatter than an eighth. Okay? And then what you're going to do is make certain you use a stitch length that's pretty short. 10 to 12 stitches per inch is what we usually tell you in class to do, but I'm going to tell you up to 12 to 14, maybe even 16 stitches per inch is going to give you a better result, and it's going to make it easier to trim real close to those stitches without anything coming undone. Once you've sewn your bias, we're going to remove a large portion of the seam allowance to reduce the bulk. You can use your scissors for that. I'm going to use a rotary cutter. And what I do is I go down about half the distance. Right down the middle there. Once we've removed that, we're ready to turn it face out. I have this turner referred to as a fast turn. I'm going to place it inside. If you have a regular loop turner, that will work as well. You'll place it inside as well. You'll use that little latch at the end and you'll pull it back through. A little bit at a time. Don't try to rush it. The way this works, it just sits on the tube. There's a little pigtail at the end, a little corkscrew. It's got a point on it. We're going to push that through. And then I'm going to capture the end. Just run the pigtail right through the end like that. And then I'm going to bring it back through the tube. It's kind of like a little magic act. It works very well and quickly. A little bit at a time. Don't go too fast when you're doing this. It's going to come apart if you do. It'll pull off the end. So there it's going. And here it magically comes out the other end. And our tube is turned that easily. Once our spaghetti has been turned, in this case, we can go ahead and use it as is to create our button loops, and they'll work quite fine. However, it's nice to have them a little bit more robust, a bit beefier, and so I like to fill them, and I like to fill them with a thing called rat tail, and it's typically this one is 2 millimeters wide. Now the tool I have, again, is referred to as a fast turn, so I'm going to place it back inside. You can use your regular tube turner to do this as well. So you would just place it on the inside just like I'm doing. You're going to do it a little bit at a time. There we are. And if you had a regular tube turner, you have that little hook on the end. What you would do is you would latch the rat tail on there and then you'd pull it back through. What I'm going to do is simply place the rat tail inside and kind of fish it through. It's almost there. There it comes out the end. I'm going to grab my tube and the rat tail and bring it out. Again, a little bit at a time. There we have it. And now I've got this nice bias that's going to turn nicely. I'm going to have really clean button loops when I do it this way. Once your spaghetti is prepared, then go ahead and cut it into individual pieces for your button loops. In this case, I've cut 2-inch pieces. It's important to cut them to length because if you're not careful, you can get these to be in different sizes. And so it's a little fussier to work with if they're precisely cut. However, it's going to make your life more successful on the other side of it because all of your loops are going to be exactly the same length when you're completed. When I'm ready to sew, I'm simply going to take my loops, I'm going to fold them together so that the legs are together as tight as possible, and then I'm going to stay stitch them in place. My seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch, so anything between the seam allowance and the cut edge of the fabric, that margin there, I can go ahead and stay stitch and I don't have to worry about taking it out. It'll be hidden by next row of stitches. So I'll go ahead and stay stitch these here, and I'll continue my way down the path. And the paper just simply helps you to support them. It also gives you specific placement for each one of them. I've sewn the loops to the paper, and I want to point out a couple of things that I've done. When I'm sewing, I try to keep a seam allowance, the sewn line portion of the spaghetti, toward the inside as much as possible so that it doesn't read either side. Okay. The other thing I try to do is keep those legs really nested right next to one another. So I stitch the first one back and forth, and then once I put the needle down, I shove the other leg right next to it using my stiletto or my awl, right? And then I can get that one captured. Go ahead and stitch to the next one, and then capture that one, and then push the other leg to it. Continue in that fashion the entire length, making sure that everything lines up nicely. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and sew the fabric to the loops. Okay. We're going to use this as our cut edge. We're going to line those edges here, and we're going to sew right through it 1/4 of an inch. Now it's real important when we do that we're careful that our loops don't slip. We don't want them to push down or push up. So I always just check while I'm sewing to make sure they're coming out the side really cleanly so that they don't have a chance to move down or move up. Okay, we'll do that first, and then we'll go ahead and take the paper away and we'll add our facing in. Sew the loops to the self and the paper. Everything's in place. I can check my work. I can see it's clean. At this point, I can go ahead and take the paper out. Okay. The paper's been removed. I'm ready to sew the self to the facing. Okay. Now in this case, what I've done is I sewed my loops on at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to tell you another little quick trick here. As you may recall, when I sewed them to the paper first, I sewed them at the margin between 1/4 inch and the cut edge. If I'd actually sewn them to the fabric at that same margin right now, I could leave the stitching in, and I wouldn't have to be worried about whether or not, when I align them up this time, I sewed them at 1/4 inch, whether or not my 1/4 inch stitching that I did them with will show. Okay, so just a little quick trick. Once you sew it to the paper, stay within the margin between the cut line and the sewing line. When you sew it to the self, the same thing, cut line and the sewing line in the margin, and then finally, when you sew it to this facing, run it all the way at your 1/4 inch stitch. Now, something that'll make your life a little easier as well is when you sew it with this prior sewing line on the top of the work. That way you can see where it is, and then you can sew ever so slightly inside of that as well. So you capture it, and then you won't risk seeing that stitch. Now that my button loops have been sandwiched between myself and my facing, I'm ready to go ahead and understitch on the facing. I'm going to direct all my seam allowances toward the facing, and I'm going to understitch 1/16 of an inch away from the edge on the facing portion. We've understitched, directing all the seam allowances toward the facing. By virtue of that, the magic of understitching makes those seam allowances wrap to the back nicely, so you won't worry about seeing the lining or the facing portion of your garment. And our button loops are complete. Thank you for joining me today. Again, my name is Russell Conte. I'm on faculty with LA Trade Tech College in Los Angeles, California. If you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be happy to help in any way I can. In the meantime, have a great day sewing.